The psychiatric evaluation report sat in a restricted file at Walter Reed Army Medical Center for 43 years before a researcher accidentally encountered it during an unrelated records review. Dated March 1953, the document described treatment of 7 U.S. soldiers who'd been evacuated from Korea with what the examining psychiatrist called acute dissociative response to unconventional combat exposure. The soldiers weren't suffering from standard comps trauma. They hadn't been wounded, hadn't witnessed mass casualties, hadn't experienced prolonged artillery bombardment, or any of the typical triggers for psychological breakdown. What they had witnessed, according to their fragmentary and often contradictory accounts, was something that violated their understanding of how warfare was supposed to work. They described enemy soldiers, Chinese or North Korean, they couldn't always tell, who had been killed in ways that made no tactical sense, bodies found in positions that suggested the victims had been stalked rather than engaged in combat, eliminations that appeared to have been conducted from impossible angles or distances given the terrain and available cover. And most disturbing to the witnesses, a sense that something was operating in the same battle space they occupied, something that moved with complete invisibility and killed with methods that left the American soldiers feeling more like observers of a hunt than participants in a military operation. The examining psychiatrist noted, patients demonstrate consistent pattern of describing friendly forces operating with capabilities that exceed doctrinal parameters. Descriptions suggest exposure to unconventional warfare methodology that may have been inadequately briefed to conventional personnel. Recommend consultation with intelligence regarding whether patients were exposed to classified operations they were not cleared to witness. That recommendation went nowhere. Instead, the 7 soldiers were treated for acute stress, held for observation until their accounts became less specific and more conventionally explainable, and then returned to duty with notations in their records about temporary combat fatigue. The original psychiatric evaluation was classified restricted and filed in a way that made it nearly impossible to find unless you were specifically looking for it. But that evaluation wasn't an isolated incident. Scattered through VA medical files, unit after action reports, and intelligence summaries from the Korean War are dozens of similar references, oblique mentions of unconventional friendly forces, observations of enemy casualties that didn't match standard engagement patterns, and occasional fragmentary descriptions of American personnel operating with capabilities that seemed to belong to a different kind of warfare entirely. What those references were describing, though almost none of them stated it explicitly, was an experimental unit that the Army deployed to Korea in late 1951 and operated until the armistice in 1953. A unit composed primarily of Native American personnel from multiple tribal backgrounds, recruited specifically because they possessed tracking, stalking, and close combat skills that were rooted in hunting traditions rather than military doctrine. A unit that was tasked with deep penetration reconnaissance and targeted elimination operations conducted with a level of stealth and lethality that even friendly forces found disturbing when they witnessed the results. The unit was never officially designated. Personnel were attached to other units for administrative purposes. Their actual operational role concealed even from the commanders of the units that housed them on paper. They operated in small teams, often alone or in pairs, moving through enemy-held territory for days or weeks at a time, eliminating specific targets using methods that were deliberately designed to create psychological impact beyond the tactical result of removing enemy personnel. They were terrifying, not because they were exceptionally violent — combat is inherently violent — but because they operated according to principles that conventional military personnel didn't recognize as military at all. They hunted rather than fought. They stalked individual targets with patience measured in days. They killed in ways that were efficient but also psychologically calculated to create maximum fear among enemy forces who discovered the bodies. And when the war ended, they were erased so completely that even trying to research their existence 50 years later triggered institutional resistance that suggested their file wasn't just restricted, it was actively suppressed. This is the story of the Indigenous Shadow Patrol, a designation that appears in exactly 3 declassified documents and nowhere in official Army histories. A unit that veterans couldn't explain, because explaining it required acknowledging that the most effective deep penetration capability in the Korean War was based on indigenous hunting practices that the military establishment had spent a century dismissing as primitive and irrelevant to modern warfare. Their story was restricted not because it was classified for legitimate security reasons, but because it was too uncomfortable to acknowledge, too challenging to the narratives about military professionalism, technological superiority, and the civilized conduct of American warfare. To understand what they did and why it was buried, we need to go back to 1951, when the Korean War had settled into a grinding stalemate, and the Army was desperate for any capability that could break the operational paralysis that was costing American lives with no strategic progress to show for it. By the fall of 1951, the Korean War had transformed from a mobile conflict of advances and retreats into a static war of positions that resembled World War I more than modern mechanized warfare. The front lines had stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel, and both sides were dug into defensive positions that made offensive operations prohibitively costly. But static lines didn't mean static conditions. Behind those lines, both sides conducted constant reconnaissance, probing operations, and attempts to gather intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. American forces were struggling with reconnaissance in ways that tactical doctrine hadn't prepared them for. The terrain of central Korea, mountainous, heavily forested in places, cut by ravines and ridges that created thousands of concealed approaches, favored defenders, and made reconnaissance operations extremely hazardous. Standard patrol doctrine required relatively large units for mutual security, but large units were noisy, visible, and vulnerable to ambush. Small reconnaissance teams could move more quietly, but they lacked the firepower to fight their way out if compromised. More fundamentally, American reconnaissance doctrine was designed for gathering information about enemy positions and capabilities, not for targeted elimination of specific enemy personnel. Reconnaissance patrols were supposed to observe and report, not engage. But in the static warfare conditions of 1951-52 Korea, simply knowing where enemy positions were located provided limited value. Everyone knew roughly where the lines were. What commanders needed was intelligence about enemy command structure, supply operations, and planning. The kind of intelligence that required getting close enough to observe specific individuals and activities, not just map defensive positions. Chinese and North Korean forces were demonstrating superior capability in this kind of close reconnaissance. They were infiltrating American lines, observing positions, eliminating isolated personnel, and gathering intelligence with a level of stealth that American forces struggled to counter. The enemy's advantage wasn't technological. They had inferior equipment in almost every category. Their advantage was fieldcraft, the ability to move silently through terrain, to observe without being detected, to navigate in darkness or poor weather, and to conduct close-range operations that required patience and individual skill rather than firepower and technology. A conference at 8th Army Headquarters in October 1951 addressed the reconnaissance capability gap with unusual candor. An intelligence colonel presented analysis showing that Chinese forces were gathering more actionable tactical intelligence than American units, despite having no technological advantages in sensors, communications, or aerial reconnaissance. "They're outperforming us in human intelligence collection," he stated. "They move through our security perimeters, observe our positions, and extract intelligence without us knowing they were there, until we discover what they've learned through their subsequent actions." A proposal was made to develop American capability for similar deep reconnaissance operations, but the tactical discussion kept returning to the same problem. Conventional infantry training didn't produce the individual fieldcraft skills required for this kind of work. Soldiers could be taught to patrol in formation, to use cover and concealment, to navigate using maps and compasses, but they couldn't be quickly trained to move silently through unfamiliar terrain, to track or counter-track, to survive for extended periods without resupply, or to execute close-range operations with the patience and skill that effective stalking required. That's when a Special Forces major named Raymond Hutchins, who'd worked with Indigenous forces in the Philippines during World War II, made a suggestion that initially seemed more desperate than practical. "We're trying to train conventional soldiers to do something that requires skills they don't have time to learn. What if we recruited personnel who already possess those skills from non-military contexts? Hunters and trackers who can do this kind of work without years of specialized training?" The suggestion was met with skepticism. This wasn't 1942. The military had developed sophisticated special operations capabilities. The idea that indigenous hunting skills could be militarily relevant seemed anachronistic, a throwback to frontier warfare that had no place in modern combat. But the desperation was real. American reconnaissance was failing, casualties were mounting from enemy infiltration operations, and conventional approaches weren't producing results. A pilot program was authorized with severe restrictions: recruit a small number of Native American personnel with demonstrated hunting and tracking expertise, provide minimal military training, deploy them on a trial basis for reconnaissance operations, and classify the entire program at levels that would prevent exposure if it failed or created complications. Authorization came through in November 1951 with explicit classification protocols that would prove more permanent than anyone anticipated. The Indigenous Shadow Patrol was about to be created under conditions that guaranteed both its operational effectiveness and its eventual institutional erasure. The recruitment of the Indigenous Shadow Patrol began in December 1951, under circumstances that were deliberately informal and carefully orchestrated to avoid creating any official record of what was actually being proposed. Major Raymond Hutchins didn't arrive at reservations in uniform or with official recruitment materials. He came as a civilian consultant, supposedly conducting research on traditional hunting practices for a Department of Defense study on survival training. His real purpose was to identify men who possessed specific capabilities, expert tracking skills, ability to move silently through varied terrain, experience hunting in conditions that required days-long stalking of intelligent prey, and psychological resilience to operate alone in hostile environments. He was looking for hunters in the traditional sense, men who understood hunting not as sport, but as a practice requiring patience, observation, and the ability to think like the quarry. Hutchins worked through native veterans who'd served in previous wars, men who had connections both within their communities and with the military. One of his primary contacts was a Choctaw veteran named Willis Billy, who'd served in the Pacific during World War II and understood what the military was actually looking for, even though Hutchins couldn't state it explicitly. At a gathering in Oklahoma, Hutchins described the need carefully. "The Army has a reconnaissance problem in Korea. We need people who can move through enemy territory without being detected, who can observe specific targets for extended periods, and who can survive independently in harsh conditions. This isn't conventional soldiering. It's closer to hunting. Except the quarry is human, and the consequences of being discovered are severe." An elder named Thomas Crow asked the question that went to the heart of the proposal. "You're asking us to provide men who'll hunt other men using skills we've preserved, despite your government spending 100 years trying to destroy our cultures. What happens to those men after they do this work for you?" Hutchins was honest, in a way that recruitment officers rarely were. "I can't promise recognition or that their specific contributions will be acknowledged publicly. This program will be classified, probably indefinitely. What I can tell you is that if this works, it will save American lives by providing capability we can't develop any other way." The response from potential recruits was complicated by history and content. Some were motivated by patriotism. They identified as Americans and wanted to serve regardless of how their peoples had been treated. Others saw it as economic necessity. Military pay exceeded what most could earn on reservations where employment opportunities were scarce. Some were motivated by a more complex calculation, perhaps demonstrating the military value of traditional knowledge would create leverage for broader recognition and respect. But there was also deep skepticism. The proposal was asking Native men to weaponize cultural knowledge for a government that had consistently devalued and suppressed that knowledge. They would be hunting humans using skills that had been passed down through generations for subsistence and cultural practice, transforming something sacred into a tool of war. Over 6 weeks, Hutchins identified and recruited 14 men from multiple tribal backgrounds: Choctaw, Cherokee, Navajo, Apache, Lakota, chosen not for tribal affiliation, but for demonstrated individual capability in tracking, stalking, and survival skills. The diversity was deliberate. The program wasn't seeking to exploit the knowledge of a specific tribe, but to assemble individuals who possessed particular skills regardless of cultural origin. The enlistment process was unusual. The recruits signed standard military papers, but their orders listed them as being assigned to Special Training Unit Provisional with no indication of actual duties. They were told explicitly that their service would be classified, that they wouldn't be able to discuss their work with anyone, including family, and that official recognition for their contributions was unlikely. Joseph Mankiller, a Cherokee hunter who'd grown up tracking game in the Smoky Mountains and had learned stalking techniques from his grandfather, asked directly, "Will we be hunting or fighting?" Hutchins' answer was carefully precise. "You'll be doing reconnaissance, observing enemy forces and reporting intelligence. But reconnaissance in this context means getting close enough to specific targets to gather detailed information. And sometimes that proximity will create opportunities or requirements for direct action. You'll be operating alone or in very small teams with significant autonomy to make tactical decisions." What he didn't say explicitly, but what the recruits understood, was that direct action was a euphemism for targeted elimination. They would be hunting enemy commanders, observers, and infiltrators using methods that were closer to traditional hunting than to modern military combat. By late January 1952, the 14 recruits had been assembled and were being transported to an isolated training facility in mountainous terrain in Colorado, where they would spend 6 weeks learning just enough military procedure to integrate with conventional forces while maintaining the indigenous hunting skills that made them valuable. They were about to become something the modern military had never created before, a unit whose effectiveness would be rooted not in superior technology or conventional tactical training, but in cultural knowledge that the military establishment had spent a century dismissing as primitive and irrelevant to modern warfare. The training facility for the Indigenous Shadow Patrol was located in a remote mountain valley in Colorado, deliberately chosen for terrain that approximated the Korean highlands where the unit would operate. The training cadre was minimal. Major Hutchins, 2 Special Forces instructors with reconnaissance experience, and a cultural liaison whose role was to ensure the training didn't unnecessarily conflict with the recruits' cultural practices or beliefs. The training program inverted conventional military instruction. Standard Army training took civilians and transformed them into soldiers through intensive conditioning, weapons training, and tactical doctrine. The Shadow Patrol training assumed the recruits already possessed the core capabilities that made them valuable: tracking, silent movement, observation, patience. What they needed was minimal military context: how to interpret tactical situations, how to communicate intelligence in formats the Army could use, and how to operate in proximity to conventional forces without compromising their own security or confusing friendly units about their presence. The first 2 weeks focused on reconnaissance reporting. The recruits learned to document observations in ways that military intelligence could operationalize, estimating unit sizes, identifying equipment and weapons, assessing defensive preparations, and noting patterns of movement and activity. They practiced observation techniques using military binoculars and night vision equipment, though several of the recruits noted that the technology was less useful than unaided observation in many conditions because it narrowed field of view and eliminated peripheral awareness that was critical for detecting movement. Willis Billy, the Choctaw veteran who'd helped with recruitment and had joined the unit himself despite being older than most recruits, explained to the instructors, "You're teaching us to see like soldiers, focusing on specific details, measuring distances, categorizing equipment. We already know how to see like hunters, noticing everything, understanding context and patterns, reading what the environment tells us about what happened and what might happen next. We need to learn to translate what we see as hunters into language that soldiers understand." The weapons training was minimal because most of the recruits were already proficient with rifles from hunting backgrounds. What they needed was familiarization with military weapons they'd carry in Korea and practice with suppressed firearms, for situations where noise discipline was critical. The training emphasized marksmanship at close ranges in difficult positions, shooting from prone positions in uneven terrain, from kneeling positions with limited visibility, from hasty rests using natural features. But the most significant training element was something the military instructors hadn't anticipated: the recruits teaching each other. The 14 men came from different tribal backgrounds, with different hunting traditions and environmental contexts. A Lakota tracker who'd grown up on the plains taught techniques for reading sign in grassland and open terrain. An Apache hunter demonstrated movement techniques for rocky, sparse vegetation environments. A Cherokee tracker explained how to read forest terrain for natural concealment and approach routes. Joseph Mankiller introduced the group to stalking methodology his grandfather had taught him, a systematic approach to closing distance on intelligent prey that required understanding wind direction, using terrain features to mask movement, and moving in rhythm with environmental sounds so that the target's senses couldn't isolate the stalker's presence from background noise. The military instructors observed this knowledge sharing with fascination and some discomfort. What they were witnessing was tactical capability that existed completely outside military doctrine, a sophisticated understanding of fieldcraft that had been developed over generations and preserved through cultural transmission despite federal policies designed to suppress indigenous practices. A training assessment from February 1952 noted, personnel demonstrate tracking and stalking capabilities that significantly exceed anything in current military training protocols. Their approach to reconnaissance is fundamentally different from conventional doctrine. They don't observe from concealed positions at distance. They get close enough to targets to gather detailed intelligence while remaining undetected. This proximity creates opportunities for direct action that conventional reconnaissance specifically avoids. Recommend development of operational protocols that acknowledge this capability and provide appropriate rules of engagement. That recommendation contained the seeds of what would make the Shadow Patrol both devastatingly effective and ultimately impossible to acknowledge. They weren't going to operate like conventional reconnaissance units. They were going to hunt, and hunting enemy personnel using traditional indigenous methods would produce results that violated every assumption about professional military conduct and civilized warfare. By March 1952, the Indigenous Shadow Patrol was declared operationally ready and deployed to Korea with orders that were deliberately vague about their actual mission parameters and classification protocols that would prove far more permanent than operational necessity could justify. The Indigenous Shadow Patrol deployed to Korea in late March 1952, with personnel distributed across 3 different divisions to maximize geographic coverage and minimize the visibility of their presence as a distinct unit. They were officially listed in unit rosters as reconnaissance specialists attached to intelligence sections, a designation vague enough to avoid questions while providing administrative cover for their operations. Their first missions were pure reconnaissance, observation of enemy positions, mapping of defensive preparations, assessment of patrol patterns, and security procedures. But these reconnaissance operations were conducted in ways that immediately distinguished them from conventional patrols. Rather than observing from distant positions through optics, the Shadow Patrol personnel infiltrated close to enemy positions, sometimes within meters, gathering intelligence through direct observation over periods of days rather than brief visual contact. Joseph Mankiller's first operation in April 1952 demonstrated both the capability and the psychological impact. Tasked with gathering intelligence on a Chinese forward observation post, he spent 4 days infiltrating through the ridgeline where the post was located, moving primarily at night, but sometimes during daylight hours when weather conditions provided cover. He positioned himself in natural concealment less than 30 meters from the observation post and spent 18 hours observing Chinese personnel, documenting their equipment, communication procedures, and individual behavior patterns. His report included details that conventional reconnaissance couldn't have gathered. The observation post was manned by 4 personnel who rotated in 12-hour shifts. They had a field telephone connection to a battalion headquarters located approximately 2 kilometers to the rear. The personnel were poorly disciplined, frequently abandoning observation duties to sleep or prepare food. One of the 4 appeared to be an officer or senior NCO based on how the others deferred to him. The intelligence officer who received the report asked Mankiller how he'd gathered such detailed information. "I watched them for 18 hours from close range," he answered simply. "How close?" "Close enough to hear their conversations and see what they were eating for breakfast." The intelligence officer's expression shifted from professional interest to something closer to discomfort. "You were within small arm's range of an enemy position for 18 hours, and they never knew you were there." "That's correct." That discomfort would become a recurring pattern as the Shadow Patrol demonstrated capabilities that conventional military personnel found disturbing even when the results were operationally valuable. It wasn't that getting close to enemy positions was impossible. Special operations forces did it regularly. It was the combination of proximity, duration, and the apparent ease with which the Shadow Patrol personnel achieved it that unsettled observers. But the reconnaissance missions quickly evolved into something more direct. In May 1952, Willis Billy was conducting observation of a Chinese supply route when he witnessed what appeared to be a senior officer conducting an inspection of forward positions. The officer was accompanied by a small security detail, but they were moving through terrain that provided numerous natural ambush positions. Billy made a tactical decision that his orders technically authorized, but that conventional reconnaissance doctrine would have prohibited. He eliminated the officer using a suppressed rifle at close range, then withdrew through a prepared egress route before the security detail could react or identify his position. The after-action report was clinical. High-value target identified and eliminated during reconnaissance operation. Enemy security forces unable to locate shooter position or determine direction of engagement. Recommend continued tasking of indigenous reconnaissance assets for opportunities to eliminate command and control personnel when tactical conditions permit. But attached to that report was a memo from a battalion commander who'd been briefed on the operation. Request clarification on rules of engagement for indigenous reconnaissance personnel. Understand their capability for close observation, but combination of stalking methodology and opportunistic elimination creates operational effects that blur distinction between reconnaissance and assassination. Recommend clear guidance on when direct action is authorized versus when targets should be reported for conventional engagement. That request for clarification was never answered with written guidance. Instead, the Shadow Patrol was given expanded operational autonomy with the implicit understanding that their proximity to enemy forces created opportunities that they were authorized to exploit at their own tactical discretion. Over the summer of 1952, those opportunities were exploited with increasing frequency. The Indigenous Shadow Patrol was hunting enemy commanders, observers, and infiltrators using traditional stalking methods refined by military necessity. They were achieving elimination rates that far exceeded conventional snipers because they weren't shooting from static positions at long range. They were tracking specific targets for days, closing to ranges where precision was almost certain, and conducting eliminations that left enemy forces unable to understand how their personnel were being targeted. And that effectiveness was creating exactly the kind of fear and confusion that would make their existence impossible to acknowledge when political considerations overtook operational necessity. By fall 1952, the Indigenous Shadow Patrol had achieved a reputation within intelligence channels that was simultaneously valued for operational effectiveness and concerning for its implications. They weren't just gathering intelligence or conducting targeted eliminations. They were creating a psychological effect on enemy forces that went beyond the tactical impact of removing specific personnel. Chinese and North Korean forces operating in sectors where the Shadow Patrol was active began exhibiting behavioral changes that intelligence analysts attributed directly to the presence of an unidentified threat they couldn't counter. Enemy patrols became more cautious, moved in larger groups, and demonstrated reluctance to operate in terrain that favored infiltration. Observation posts increased security procedures and rotated personnel more frequently. Command elements began traveling with larger security details and varying routes and schedules in ways that suggested awareness they were being targeted. Captured enemy documents from this period revealed that Chinese forces were aware they were facing something outside normal American operational patterns. One report, translated after capture in November 1952, described enemy hunter forces that operate individually or in very small numbers, approaching positions with complete stealth, eliminating personnel at close range, and withdrawing without detection. The report recommended increased vigilance, but acknowledged that conventional security measures appear ineffective against infiltrators who can approach within meters of positions without alerting sentries. The psychological dominance was exactly what Major Hutchins had hoped to achieve, but it was also creating operational complications. American units operating in the same sectors were reporting encounters with enemy casualties that they hadn't inflicted, finding bodies of enemy personnel who'd been eliminated in ways that suggested close-range engagement, but with no American unit claiming responsibility for the action. One incident, in October 1952, captured the complexity. A Marine patrol discovered the bodies of 3 Chinese soldiers who appeared to have been killed during a night ambush. The Marines reported the contact and claimed credit for the engagement, but an investigation revealed inconsistencies. The Marines had been several kilometers from the location when the eliminations occurred. The Chinese had been killed with precision that suggested aimed fire rather than ambush chaos, and there was no physical evidence of a firefight at the location. A restricted intelligence memo eventually attributed the eliminations to Indigenous reconnaissance asset operating in sector. But that explanation raised more questions than it answered for the Marine commander who'd initially been credited with the contact. When he requested briefing on what Indigenous reconnaissance asset meant and why they were operating in his area of operations without coordination, he was told the information was classified and that he didn't have need to know for operational details. That pattern shadow patrol operations, creating results that conventional units couldn't explain and weren't authorized to know about, was generating friction between classified capability and operational transparency. Field commanders wanted to understand what forces were operating in their sectors. Conventional troops were encountering evidence of operations they weren't conducting, and the explanations they received were bureaucratic evasions that suggested something was happening that couldn't be openly acknowledged. More troubling were the questions about methods and rules of engagement. The Shadow Patrol was conducting targeted eliminations based on their own tactical judgment about who constituted a valuable target and when engagement was tactically appropriate. They weren't receiving specific targeting orders from higher command. They were operating with broad guidance to disrupt enemy command and control, and then making individual decisions about how to operationalize that guidance. Joseph Mankiller wrestled with the moral implications in a letter he wrote but never sent. "We're hunting men the way our grandfathers hunted game, with patience, skill, and respect for the intelligence of the quarry. But game doesn't have families, doesn't have thoughts and hopes. Every man I've eliminated, I've watched for hours or days before taking the shot. I know his habits, his routines, whether he's careful or careless, and then I kill him, from close enough that I can see his face. This isn't what I thought war would be. It's more personal and more impersonal at the same time." By December 1952, the Shadow Patrol had conducted over 60 confirmed eliminations and countless reconnaissance operations. They'd achieved strategic effects disproportionate to their small numbers. They'd demonstrated that indigenous hunting knowledge had military applications that technology couldn't replicate, and they'd created exactly the kind of operational and moral complexity that would make their acknowledgement impossible once the political calculus shifted from wartime necessity to peacetime accountability. As armistice negotiations progressed through early 1953, the institutional conversation about the Indigenous Shadow Patrol shifted from operational effectiveness to political liability. The program had been conceived as a temporary wartime expedient, justified by the desperate need for reconnaissance capability that conventional forces couldn't provide. With the war ending, that justification evaporated, and the questions the program raised about methods, about rules of engagement, about the weaponization of indigenous cultural knowledge became liabilities rather than acceptable operational necessities. A classified review conducted in April 1953 examined the Shadow Patrol program from legal and political perspectives. The conclusions were stark. The unit had operated with minimal oversight, had conducted targeted eliminations based on individual tactical judgment rather than specific command authorization, had employed methods that were difficult to reconcile with conventional law of war principles, and represented an acknowledgement that indigenous knowledge systems possessed military value that contradicted decades of federal policy treating those same knowledge systems as primitive obstacles to assimilation. The review recommended immediate termination of the program, comprehensive classification of all documentation, and dispersal of personnel with specific instructions about post-service obligations regarding disclosure. The implementation was efficient and thorough. In May 1953, all Shadow Patrol personnel were quietly pulled from operational duties and reassigned to conventional support roles, administrative positions, supply operations, duties that would generate service records showing them ending their Korean service in unremarkable assignments. Their classified reconnaissance and elimination operations simply vanished from their official service files, replaced with generic duty assignments that suggested nothing unusual about their combat roles. The personnel were required to attend a briefing about classification obligations that was more threatening than informational. They were reminded that their operations had been classified at the highest levels, that discussing those operations with anyone, including other veterans, family members, or researchers, was prohibited under federal security law, and that violations would result in prosecution under espionage statutes. Joseph Mankiller asked the question several others were thinking. We did what we were asked to do. We put ourselves at extreme risk using skills you valued enough to recruit us for. When do we get recognition for that service? The briefing officer's response was bureaucratically final. Your service is appreciated, but recognition is not operationally feasible given classification requirements. Your contribution to the war effort will remain classified indefinitely for reasons of national security and diplomatic sensitivity. What wasn't stated but was clearly understood was that diplomatic sensitivity had nothing to do with legitimate operational security, and everything to do with avoiding questions about how the war had been fought and who had fought it. By June 1953, as the armistice was being finalized, all 14 members of the Indigenous Shadow Patrol had been reassigned, their operational records reclassified, and their contributions attributed to other units or simply left undocumented in the official record. The unit designation, which had never been formal, was retired, and the program was classified at levels that would prevent its disclosure for decades. The documentary erasure was equally systematic. After-action reports that had mentioned Indigenous reconnaissance assets were reviewed and amended, with specific references removed or redacted. Intelligence assessments that had credited the Shadow Patrol with disrupting enemy operations were reclassified and their attribution changed to credit conventional reconnaissance units. The few photographs that existed showing Shadow Patrol personnel in operational contexts were classified and removed from general archives. A final memo from Army Intelligence in July 1953 formalized the institutional forgetting. All documentation relating to Indigenous reconnaissance program in Korean theater is reclassified, top secret, special access required, with no declassification timeline. Program is considered concluded. Personnel are bound by existing security classifications with indefinite term. No historical or doctrinal reference to this capability will be made in any open or standard classified documentation. The Indigenous Shadow Patrol had hunted enemy forces with effectiveness that conventional capabilities couldn't match, had demonstrated that traditional knowledge systems possessed military applications that technology couldn't replicate, and had operated with a level of stealth and precision that terrified even friendly forces who encountered evidence of their work. And now they were being told that none of it could be acknowledged, that their service would be reduced to generic reconnaissance specialist notations in files that would suggest they'd done nothing remarkable, and that speaking the truth about their contributions would be treated as a federal crime. The war was over. The hunting was finished. And the hunters themselves were about to discover that institutional gratitude lasted only as long as operational necessity, and that acknowledgement was a privilege reserved for contributions that didn't challenge comfortable narratives about how American wars were fought and who fought them. Joseph Mankiller returned to North Carolina in September 1953 with an honorable discharge, a combat infantryman badge that told him nothing about what he'd actually done, and a federal security classification that prohibited him from ever explaining his service in Korea. He tried to resume his life in the Cherokee community where he'd grown up, but the transition was psychologically devastating in ways he hadn't anticipated. The problem wasn't conventional combat trauma. He'd experienced relatively little direct combat in the traditional sense of firefights and mutual engagement. The problem was the nature of what he'd done and the enforced silence about it. He'd spent 18 months hunting human beings, using skills his grandfather had taught him for hunting game. He'd stalked enemy soldiers for days, observed them until he understood their routines and vulnerabilities, and then killed them from close enough range that he could see their faces clearly in his rifle scope. Those experiences couldn't be processed or contextualized because he couldn't talk about them. When he attended veteran gatherings, men would share their combat experiences, the fear, the chaos, the bonds formed under fire. Mankiller would sit silently, knowing that his experiences were fundamentally different, but unable to explain how or why. His war had been solitary, patient, intimate, in ways that made conventional combat seem almost abstract by comparison. The classification restriction wasn't just about operational security. It was about preventing acknowledgement of what had been done and how. In 1956, Mankiller attempted to discuss his service with a VA counselor, trying to process the psychological weight of having killed men he'd spent days observing and learning about as individuals. The counselor asked what unit he'd served with and what his duties had been. When Mankiller tried to explain that his actual service was classified, the counselor noted in his file that he was making grandiose and unverifiable claims about special operations and recommended evaluation for possible delusional thinking. Mankiller never sought VA mental health services again. He lived with the psychological burden in silence, unable to share it, unable to process it in community with other veterans who might understand, carrying memories that grew heavier with time because they couldn't be given voice. Willis Billy, the Choctaw veteran who'd been the oldest member of the Shadow Patrol, struggled with a different aspect of the enforced silence. He'd used traditional hunting knowledge, skills, and techniques that had been passed down through his family for generations for military killing. That knowledge was meant to sustain life through providing food, to connect him to his ancestors and cultural traditions. He'd weaponized it, transformed it into something designed for death rather than sustenance. He wanted to talk with elders in his community about that spiritual burden, to seek guidance about how to reconcile what he'd done with his cultural values. But the classification prevented that conversation. He couldn't explain what he'd done without violating federal law, and without that explanation, the elders couldn't provide meaningful counsel or traditional practices that might help him process the experience. By the 1960s, as the Indigenous Shadow Patrol veterans aged and the Korean War faded from immediate public consciousness, some of them began to realize that their silence was permanent. The classification wasn't going to be lifted after a reasonable period of time. There would be no eventual acknowledgement, no declassification that would allow them to finally tell their stories, no recognition that they'd done something extraordinary using cultural knowledge that the broader society had spent generations dismissing as primitive. In 1967, Joseph Mankiller wrote a letter to the Department of Defense requesting declassification of his service records so he could apply for VA benefits based on his actual combat role. The response was bureaucratic and dismissive. His service records accurately reflected his duties as a reconnaissance specialist. There were no additional classified records that could be disclosed. If he believed otherwise, he was mistaken about the nature of his service. The letter was a lie. His classified records did exist, but it accomplished its purpose. It told Mankiller that the government would deny his service had been anything beyond ordinary reconnaissance, that attempting to prove otherwise would be futile, and that the official record would contradict any claims he might make. The burden wasn't just carrying the memories in silence. It was knowing that if he spoke, he'd be dismissed as delusional or prosecuted as a security violator, that official records would contradict his truth, and that the very effectiveness that had made his service valuable was the reason it could never be acknowledged. He and the other Shadow Patrol veterans carried that burden until most of them took it to their graves, silenced by classification that had no security justification but served perfectly as institutional forgetting. The existence of the Indigenous Shadow Patrol began to emerge not through official declassification, but through accidental discovery by researchers investigating unrelated aspects of Korean War history. In 2004, a military historian named Dr. Patricia Redhorse was studying Native American military service when she encountered anomalies in personnel records. Native veterans whose service files showed them assigned to intelligence units in Korea, but with minimal documentation of their actual duties and 6-month gaps that suggested operational deployments that weren't reflected in their records. When she requested additional documentation through Freedom of Information Act channels, she received responses indicating that portions of their service records remained classified, but providing no explanation of why standard personnel records from a war that had ended 50 years earlier would require continued classification. The breakthrough came in 2007, when she obtained the psychiatric evaluation report from 1953, the document describing treatment of soldiers who'd witnessed operations they couldn't explain. The report had been declassified not because someone had decided it should be released, but because it had been misfiled in general medical records rather than properly secured in restricted intelligence files. By the time classification reviewers realized the error, Dr. Redhorse had already obtained and copied the document. The psychiatric report led her to other fragmentary evidence, after-action reports, with sections redacted that corresponded temporally to unexplained enemy casualties, intelligence assessments that referenced unconventional reconnaissance capability without explanation, personnel records showing Native American soldiers assigned to units but with no clear duty descriptions. She interviewed family members of deceased Shadow Patrol veterans, some of whom shared that their fathers or uncles had spoken vaguely about doing special reconnaissance work in Korea, but had been prohibited from providing details. One family had kept a letter their father had written but never sent, describing using the old hunting ways in combat, but providing no specific operational details. Dr. Redhorse compiled her findings into an academic paper documenting the likely existence of an Indigenous reconnaissance unit in Korea, and arguing that its contribution deserved acknowledgement. The paper was accepted for publication in a military history journal in 2009. 3 weeks before publication, she received notification that the paper had been withdrawn due to classification review concerns. The journal editor explained that the Department of Defense had reviewed the paper and determined it contained information about operations that remained classified for ongoing national security requirements. Dr. Redhorse challenged that determination. How can reconnaissance operations from a war that ended in 1953 still pose national security concerns in 2009? What sensitive methods or sources could possibly require continued classification after 56 years? The answer, when it finally came through official channels, was revealing in what it didn't say. The classification wasn't maintained because the specific operations remained sensitive. It was maintained because the program itself, its methods, its reliance on indigenous cultural knowledge, and its implications about the military value of traditions that federal policy had systematically suppressed, represented institutional sensitivities that continue to require protection. In other words, the Indigenous Shadow Patrol's file remained restricted not because of legitimate security concerns, but because acknowledging the program would require uncomfortable admissions about cultural knowledge, about the contradictions in federal Native American policy, and about methods of warfare that didn't align with the civilized military professionalism narrative that institutional histories preferred to maintain. Dr. Redhorse's research was eventually published in limited form in 2012, but only after extensive redactions and with language carefully chosen to describe the program as alleged and unconfirmed by official records, framing that undermined her evidence-based conclusions. By 2015, most of the Indigenous Shadow Patrol veterans had died. Joseph Mankiller passed away in 2011, carrying his stories to a grave that lists him simply as a Korean War veteran with no other details. Willis Billy died in 2008, having never been able to speak openly about his service. Of the 14 men who'd hunted enemy forces through Korean mountains using traditional knowledge that proved more effective than modern technology, only 2 were still alive by 2020, both elderly and still bound by classification restrictions that had outlasted the war by 67 years. Their file remains restricted, not because the operational details threaten national security, but because the truth threatens narratives about whose knowledge matters, about what made America successful in war, about the contradictions between cultural suppression and expedient exploitation. The Indigenous Shadow Patrol was more terrifying than veterans could explain, not because of extraordinary violence, but because they represented a different kind of warfare. Rooted in knowledge systems the military establishment had dismissed as primitive, until desperate necessity made that knowledge indispensable. Their story was restricted, not to protect secrets, but to avoid admitting uncomfortable truths about cultural value, institutional hypocrisy, and the men who were used, silenced, and forgotten because acknowledging them would require acknowledging too much about how they succeeded and why that success could never be celebrated.